Critical race theory, it's really particularly damning to people of color. If we're going to fight racism, we have to do it with facts.
Give the gift of journalism, real journalism. Donate at brightlightnews.com today. Thank you.
All right, we're here with Dr. David Haskell from Wilfrid Laurier University, and he will be talking about critical race theory tonight, and he will be giving us a brief description of what it is and what he will not be saying on the podium tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Glenn. And the reason I want to talk about what I'm not saying is because, you know, you always want to fill in the gaps. And probably the first gap to fill in is, well, what is critical race theory? And critical race theory, first of all, isn't really a theory, because a theory we hope would be based on empirical evidence. And critical race theory is really more of an ideology. Some people have equated it to a religion of sorts. It's a worldview. It's a belief that the world should be divided into two categories, really, oppressor and oppressed. So it's taking Marxist categories, but it's applying it to race. Now, in this particular theory, what they're doing is they're saying that really white people are the oppressors. And it's the people who are non-white who are the oppressed and victims. And the problem is that even though it is saying that whites, no matter where they come from, no matter what their station in life is, they are the oppressors, it's really particularly damning to people of color because it also says that they don't have agency. And within this, we see that there is the racism of lowered expectations. It's like, well, you actually can't do what other people can do. So on both sides of it, it really is a toxic kind of ideology. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that tonight, giving the definitions. But what I won't be talking about, and what I'd like to share with you, is that there's really good research. And the research shows that when you teach this stuff in schools, and often we teach it as white privilege instruction, we teach it as anti-racism education. Those are the names that are used. Sometimes it's not called critical race theory. They know that people are catching on to that, so they're trying to change the words, white privilege instruction or anti-racism education. But we know what happens when that is taught because studies have been done. So I'll give you an example. In the Journal of Experimental Psychology General, 2019, a study was conducted to see what happens when you teach white privilege to young people. What does happen? Do they become less racist? The answer is no. What actually happens is they don't feel any difference when it comes to people of color, but they do begin to feel more hostility towards poor whites. They blame them for their circumstance. They are more caustic toward them. So this is what's happening in our school. We're teaching them things like these white privilege lessons that are actually leading to more discrimination. And it's not just that study. There's another study that was just out in May of 2022, so very recent. And it was in PLOS One, PLOS1, if anybody wanted to look it up. And they wanted to see what happens when you introduce the idea of white privilege into online conversations. So they did this experiment. What they found was it shuts conversations down. It actually makes people more polarized. And when you even had white students or white participants who were previously very supportive of racial equality, after this introduction of white privilege was introduced, they became less supportive. So again, it does harm. But I'll just finish up with a really major study because I want people to know, and there's the studies I'm talking about are not just the only ones. There are many studies out there. There was a study done by Elizabeth Paluk she's at Princeton University. She's a major psychologist, and it was done in the annual review of psychology. And what she did was a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where you take really the extant literature and you take a look at what the major finding is. So she looks at 400 studies, and she wants to look at what happens when you teach people about equity and diversity and inclusion. Does it make people more harmonious? Does it make them less racist? And her overall finding was this. It does not. It absolutely does not make people less racist. The average effect is 0. Now you might think, okay, well, it doesn't do good, but does it do harm? And yes, it does. So now, I know I said I was only going to talk about that last study, but here's this one. So it's Frank Dobbin's studies. He's done his own empirical stuff. He's done his own meta-analysis. He's Harvard, by the way. So, I mean, we like to hold these guys up and say, listen, I'm not talking about a quack. I'm talking about somebody who really knows his stuff. So Frank Dobbin, he was writing in, I believe the journal was Anthropology Now, and he said, listen, not only does it not do good, this equity, diversity, inclusion training, which is anti-racism education, which is white privilege instruction, all this stuff. He says not only does it not do good, it does harm, because it will actually activate more racism. So I'm not going to be able to go into those studies tonight, but I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. I mean, there's this paradoxical effect where we see that when you put the lens on something by trying to make it more socially equitable, you're actually making it worse. I think this is a lot of what we're seeing now within the transgender issues, critical race, the environment, right?
Yeah.
What do you think, very briefly, can you tell us, what is a way forward so that people can help to educate others that maybe perhaps these aren't the best ways to go, and our education systems do need to rethink what's actually happening?
So the way forward is really simple. We already have really good studies. And when you look at what critical race theory is doing, it's saying, forget the studies. It's saying, we want to appeal to the lived experience. We want to appeal to the narrative. And you know what? In the Enlightenment, we said, don't do that, because that actually doesn't get you out of trouble. It gets you into trouble. So if we could just return to the ideas of what do the facts say, that would be a great starting point. Because listen, I know that racism is real, but if we're going to fight racism, we have to do it with facts and not with some kind of cockamamie theory that isn't really based in fact. And that's the road ahead.
Thank you so much for your insights and your expertise. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.